Bienvenidas to Latina Literati. If you enjoy great books, wonderful stories, and interesting people, this is the channel for you. And today we are celebrating vino. It is the harvest of the grapes that we make one of our favorite beverages. Vino, it rhymes with Latino. Right now in the valleys throughout California, the grapes are being harvested. And so I thought I would talk a little bit about the history of winemaking in California, and then of course recommend some fabulous books, because there's so many books in this area, everything from history to intrigue. So I'll tell you about that in the book recommendations. But of course, let's start from the beginning. Really interesting that Baja California is the first place where there's a record of a vineyard being planted, and it was called Misionero, was the first vineyard planted in Baja California, and that was in 1683. Of course, the Franciscan priests are credited with bringing the first vines to California. They brought a lot of things from Spain to plant, and of course used the slave labor of the indigenous people around the missions to plant the grapes. So in San Juan Capistrano, there are records of 2,000 plants cultivated there. And you'll remember that these wines were used for sacramental purposes. So they didn't really have to have body and color and all of the different aspects of wine that you would judge today. They were used for sacraments, and so they just needed to be wine. In 1829, Isidro Reyes, who was the grandson of one of the alcaldes of El Pueblo de Los Angeles, established the first vineyard in that area. But even more importantly, after the sacramental wine was used up, the Angelinos actually wanted more. They actually wanted table wine. And so Reyes started experimenting and trying to better the taste of the wines that were produced in his vineyards. In 1831, Jean-Louis Vigne, V-I-G-N-E-S, arrived from France and started working with Reyes, and realized that he really needed to bring some of the Bordeaux stock to replenish and also try and make the varietals better. And so he did that and worked with Reyes for many years to establish some of the first French style vineyards in California. With the invasion in the 1840s of the gold rush, you had thousands and thousands of people invading from the east, and they mostly wanted whiskey, but sometimes they wanted vino. So sure enough, the valleys of Northern California, concentrating in Napa and in Sonoma, were planted with mostly Spanish, some French varietals. And that is where and these are the areas that we consider wine country today, although you have newer regions like Temecula and San Isidro. But let's talk about wine. We know that wine is not the oldest drink in human history. That's actually beer from the Egyptian dynasties of thousands and thousands of years ago. But we do have, there have been uncovered caves in Armenia that have tanks made of the rocks, within the rocks of the caves, that have been dated to more than 4,000 years ago. So we have been enjoying wine for a long time. Wine changes the ecosystems of where it is planted, and so there are new types of pests and birds and butterflies and other things that live among the vineyards and are affected by whatever is used in the vineyards. This video is also a moment to celebrate, because just this week the governor of California has signed into law a law that will allow farm workers, because after the enslaved indigenous people, it was basically Latinos who have made everything possible in the economy of California. Let's just be real. So everything we eat, everything we wear, if it's made here in California, the houses that we live in, everything is absolutely dependent on Latinos and Latinas to fabricate it with their hands. So as we go into harvest time and as we go into traditional times of Thanksgiving, it is only gratitude that everyone should have towards Latinas and Latinos, because we make it happen in California. That's the bottom line. The economic bottom line, the political bottom line, that is real. This week, a law was signed that starting next year, farm workers will have an easier time deciding whether or not they want to be unionized. So they will no longer have to vote under the eyes of their bosses. They can vote from home, and there are other protections as well being put in place. So that's great news, and it's a wonderful thing to celebrate as we go into the crush of the harvest of grapes. I wanted to share with you a bit of an experience that we had recently at a winery in Napa. We had flights of bubbly, some charcuterie boards. They even had a vegan charcuterie board. And then when we were done with that, we wanted to actually eat. So we went to this Mexican restaurant called Cheve, and had real food, tacos and things. And it was a fun day, and it was great to see the harvest in full swing and to see the different communities coming together to make it happen. So a lot of people in the fields, a lot of work going on in the different vineyards, in the different bodegas where they process and store the wines in barrels, although the trend seems to be steel barrels. But there's a split of authority as to how that impacts the final taste of the wine. So I don't know. I just know a good wine is a good wine, and I'm not sure the process of it. But when you have read some of the books that I recommend, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you think about wine and your favorite wines, where they come from. In another book I read, they actually have these places that you can go to try wines from A to Z. Every country from A to Z, you can try wines, spending the whole weekend drinking a little bit, not too much, of each wine from different countries. So I think that would be fun. So enjoy, and again, salud. And now for my favorite part of the video, the book recommendations. So I actually have 4 books. Normally I only do 3, but today I have 4. There are so many really good books about wine, the history of wine, our relationship to wine. I'm going to start with history of one of the world's most ancient pleasures, and that's exactly what it would seem to be. It is a history of wine, where it comes from, different varieties, where it grows, what it needs. Fascinating book, and I really recommend it. As always, all these books will be linked below. If they're not available at your local library, or if you decide not to purchase them at your local bookseller, or maybe you don't have a local bookseller, I always include them in the description box below so that you can purchase them through sites like Abe's Books or Better World Books, who leverage your purchases to fund literacy campaigns in other communities. We always want to help each other. The second book is called The Widow Clicquot, for Veuve, which means widow in French, Veuve Clicquot. And this was a woman who at 27 is widowed and decides to develop the wine portion of her husband's business, and that's what she does. And talk about breaking glass ceilings. She breaks a lot of glass bubbly, and so it's a great book and an inspiration for all sorts of women, entrepreneurs, and everybody in general. So highly recommend it. The third book is The Judgment of Paris, and if you haven't read this is just a great book. So as you probably know, the United States would not exist if it were not for France. Why? because they actually dodged the blockade that the British had along the eastern seaboard in order to supply arms, food, and everything that the colonies needed. So that's why the United States and France have always had a special relationship. That's why you get things like the Statue of Liberty being sent over, all the bottom that showed enslaved people was covered up, but still there's a special relationship. And so to mark the 200th anniversary of the United States in 1976, it's decided that the California wines especially have matured to a point where there could be a tasting. They felt like the white wines were insufficient to do a blind tasting, but they did the red. I don't know if I should tell you what happens in the end. Okay, maybe I'll tell you. So if you don't want to know what happens, just skip a few minutes right now. Blind tasting of the wines by French sommeliers and wine experts, right? Viticulturists and others. And guess what? That's right. California wines beat the French wines. And I kid you not, the French who were part of that panel literally were about to have their citizenship of France stripped from them. That's how angry everybody was at them for choosing California wines. Now, of course, they didn't know they were choosing California wines, but that really opens the floodgates, pun intended, to California wines at the international auctions and at the international sales. And so California wines all of a sudden take on a life of their own. They take on a mythic grandeur that they're able to beat the French wines at their own game, so to speak. The Grande Dame has been unseated. So it's a fabulous book, and there's a lot of intrigue and a lot of detail about what happens as they're, judging the wines and leading up to the judging of the wines. So it's a fun book, definitely recommend it. The last book is part mystery, part sleuth. So on the cover is a very ancient bottle with the initials TJ. I'm going to leave that there for a moment. It's called the Billionaires Vinegar, and you can imagine what that means. Supposedly during World War II, the French would hide cases and cases of their best wine and seal them in walls, so that every so often since the war, someone would find in a sealed wall fabulous wine that hadn't been touched for decades. So it would go to auction. Sometimes it was real, and sometimes it was found to be fake. Now, how do you fake wines like that? Well, you buy old bottles and you put new wine in it, because there are all these tests with the sediment and the seals and the this and the that. So they can kind of date the bottle, but the wine, it's not so easy, right? Especially if you're using whatever was used in those days in terms of the different elements. There's a lot of chemicals used in wine, some wines today. So the last century, it was pretty straightforward. But it's a fabulous, fabulous book. And now going back to the initials TJ. As you may know, aside from being a slaveholder and from having children by an enslaved child, Sally Jennings, Thomas Jefferson was a absolutely aficionado of wine. He loved wine, and he loved good wine. And so he would have boxes, cases and cases shipped from France. He also kept very meticulous records. Like, he would write down, I bought from Monsieur Louis such and such a wine on such and such a day, and it should be arriving whenever. So this cache of wine with these initials, TJ, came up. And so it was presumed that it was it was bound for Thomas Jefferson, never got there, and it was just found. So again, a lot of intrigue, because the Thomas Jefferson group that holds the rights to Monticello and all of his legacy would not comment. They wouldn't say yay or nay, because they couldn't find any record of it, no documentation of these wines. So it's a mystery. We don't know if it's true or not, but fascinating, all of the ins and outs of this world of wine auctions and where wine comes from. These wines that are still being found from many, many years ago. We've seen in the ships sometimes that they find these amphoras, these clay vessels that have wine from thousands of years ago, and some of them have turned out to be drinkable, unbelievable. But the Billionaires Vinegar tells you the story of wines that are not what they seem to be. So it's a fun book, great book. I had thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you will too. So in this time of harvest, in this time when we see nature and our community coming together to really not just harvest the grapes, but also it's a time to say thank you, gracias, to all those who make the bounty of our tables possible. And so thank you to all those who made the new law possible to help farm workers. And thank you so much for staying with us to the end of the video. As always, please like, share, comment. We'd love to hear from you. What are the things you'd like us to talk about? So again, always we wish you mucho salud, mucho cariño y mucho amor. Y salud.